Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 6, biological basis of language development. So here we go. We're going to look at what is actually going on in the body to support language development, or to make language development actually physically possible. Okay, so just a couple things so that you know what's going to happen in collaborate time. Basically, during collaborate time, be ready to write a scenario using your assigned language development theory from last class, and your specific one is on the next slide. So scenario should include a teacher, student or students, and an event that will showcase your understanding of the theory in the classroom. So your colleague will guess what theory you are trying to depict. So you're going to have time during our collaborate time to actually write this, but be ready. So for example, this was my scenario that I wrote. Mrs. W. Oh yeah, I want you to use like Mrs. W, Miss C, Mr. D, like use your initial. So Mrs. W is quite certain that Jacob, a boy in her grade 4 class, can put together a 500-piece puzzle of motorbikes. Mrs. W has seen him working on smaller puzzles where the pieces are more unique, but this motorbike puzzle is at the next level, with most pieces appearing to be the same shape. Mrs. W gives Jacob the puzzle during flex time, and Jacob spends the entire time on it. However, Jacob is having some trouble with completing the puzzle, as he is trying to randomly find a piece with the correct shape. Mrs. W goes and sits with Jacob and helps him develop more strategies, such as looking at the color of the edge of the piece or the overall picture on the box. By the end of the second flex period, Mrs. W only has to check on him occasionally, and by the end of the third flex period, Jacob proudly shows Mrs. W the completed puzzle. So that's the kind of scenario that I want you to write during our collaborate time, and then your colleague is going to guess which language development theory they believe that you wrote about. So that one I wrote about interactionists, and specifically about Vygotsky and zone of proximal development, and scaffolding, specifically that the teacher kept coming back and scaffolding and helping the child move to the next level, but pushing the child into their zone of proximal development where they're feeling a little uncomfortable, but with the help of the teacher, they can move on. Okay, so this will then be your theory. So you're not doing this as a group. So Tatiana, you will be writing your own scenario. Peyton, you'll be writing your own. Jackson, you'll be writing your own. Carly, you'll be writing your own. So it's not a group thing. So just be ready to write your own, and then we'll mix you up. So just a bit of a review to keep these theories fresh in your head. Okay. You will also, during collaborate time, you will dump any terms you know about the brain from the reading or the video with the crazy scientist. So he's kind of crazy. You should watch the video from your reading list. It's very informative. And try not to look back at your notes. You don't have to try to define if you don't remember. Just again, retrieve from the brain. The retrieval process has proven to be helpful in you actually learning and remembering these particular concepts. Okay, now let's jump into today's ideas around biological basis of language development. So first of all, I think we need to situate it with why bother with biological basis of language development? Like, why am I even doing this lecture today? Basically, I'm just going to read you the slide. A general knowledge of this is critical to fully appreciate and understand the human species' biologically unique capacity for language. So we're going to discuss this at the end of this lecture about that it's a human species. Language is just a human species phenomenon. But I think you need to be amazed at that this is actually happening in real time, that I am saying this mumble of sounds, and in real time you are hearing it. you are comprehending what I'm saying, you might be writing things down or typing things down all at the same time. So it's pretty amazing, the brain of what's going on in there around language. In language, the second point is a complex and distinctly human ability that resides in the neuroanatomical and neurophysiological architecture of the human brain. And we are starting to learn more about the brain development and language development through MRI. We started using the MRI in 1990. And as an aside, one of my friends in Calgary was actually part of the original design of the MRI. He's a brilliant scientist. He downplays his own skills, but brilliant in the development of this really useful tool in finding out what is going on in the brain around language development and really around everything around all brain activity. Okay, so let's have a little bit of go at some terminology and sort of let's situate this a little bit. So basically, what is neuroscience? This is what we're just dipping our toe into a little bit here. So basically, it's a branch of science that focuses on the anatomy and physiology of the nervous system. So if you have not watched the video from the reading list, this is the link for the video from the reading list. Stop the video and go and watch this, because there are going to be some things that he talks about that will just make the rest of this lecture make more sense. Okay, so if you have already watched it, just keep on going. So basically, the nervous system includes the CNS, which is the central nervous system, and the PNS, which is the peripheral nervous system. Basically, the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. And then the peripheral system is the cranial and spinal nerves that carry information inward and outward from the brain to all of our digits. And basically, neuroscientists study both nervous systems and examine how they work individually and together. Okay, so just a quick here. Just take a guess. What is this one? Central nervous system, because it's the brain and the spinal cord. Then, because you're smart people, what is this one? The peripheral, because it's going from the brain and out. Oops, from the brain. I've lost my pen here. There we go. From the brain and then out to the different parts of the body. Okay, so I'm going to go back out of this. Basic terminology. Again, you will hear me saying this. Actually, I just said this to my third years. I use this terminology. So this is terminology that you want to kind of put in there and remember. So basically, neurons are highly specialized cells that compose the nervous system. So they're highly specialized cells that compose the nervous system. The synapse is the site where the two neurons meet. So for neurons to communicate, the nerve pulse, there must be a synapse, and the nerve impulse must cross that synapse. So the neurons come together, and then they form a connection there. And this is crucial because that's how all information is shared. And then we have gray and white matter. This is the tissue formed by the linkages of thousands of neurons. So that's when they talk about gray matter. It's basically, it's all these linkages of all of these neurons. So information is generated, processed, and carried through this matter. So we need all of this to be working together to transfer all of the information that we need transferred to function. Okay, basically, go on to the next slide here, is the structure of the brain. Basically, the brain, as our crazy scientist said, is the commander of the body. And the brain is the most complex and sophisticated organ of the human body. So if you damage your brain, it's kind of an issue because it is the commander. It is the central controller of your entire body. What I want you to do is I want you to stop the video, stop my video, and I want you to go and watch this video from the beginning to about 4:45. You can watch the whole thing if you want, but up until then for sure. This video talks about a man named Phineas Cage. And this happened a long time ago, but he had brain damage, but then but lived through it. And so that was kind of the start of when they started to realize that the brain was made up of all these different areas that had different functions. So have a look at that. Stop me. Go watch this video, and it's the crazy scientist guy. So be ready because it goes quickly. Okay. Isn't that interesting about Phineas Cage, about what happened to him? You know, rod through, could still function, but personality really changed. So that's when the scientists started to go, the brain does not act as a whole, but the brain has these different parts in it that control different aspects of language, personality, of bodily function. And so that was sort of the start of thinking of the brain not as one whole massive unit that works just together, but that it has different parts. Okay, so let's now look at what we know about the brain. So we know that it comes in separate parts. So basically you have the cerebrum, which is basically this whole, I'm going to use my pencil, this whole shebang in here. Oh, maybe I should use different color than blue. How about pink? Okay. It also, and the cerebrum, the whole is basically all your reasoning, all your problem solving, all your planning, all your hypothesizing is what is happening there. You also have the right and left hemisphere, right? So the right and left hemisphere, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And there's a chasm in the middle. I'm actually going to erase. There's this chasm in the middle. Sorry. But it's connected. The two parts are connected. The neurons fire across the chasm. Okay, I'm going to click back here. Here is a little bit more detailed look at the brain. So there are several lobes in each hemisphere. So you can see frontal lobe, temporal lobe, pons medulla oblongata, cerebellum, occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe in here. So you have these lobes in each of the right and left hemispheres. Basically, when we're talking about, you've probably heard the idea of the frontal lobe and how the frontal lobe is where the higher order cognitive abilities happen. This is where you start to be able to reason, you start to be able to really look at logic, you start to be able to look at something and go, okay, these are all of the aspects of that. Okay, and then we have the two temporal lobes, which I'm going to go to the next slide and let you have a look at those. Okay, the two temporal lobes, basically what those guys are doing is these are the two lobes that we are mainly concerned with when we talk about language development. All the other areas of the brain are interesting, but we're going to focus on two temporal lobes. So basically these two lobes process auditory information, so everything you're hearing. They process language comprehension, so that you're actually understanding me, recognition of speech sounds. These two lobes are the critical sites for language comprehension, and they're critical sites for convergences of receiving and integrating associations. So, for example, a person sees an object, names it, speaks the name of the object. So these lobes are super important, particularly these two temporal lobes are in language development. Okay, so basically, how does the human brain process and produce language? Again, I put this on here. It's kind of text heavy, but I wanted you to have this written out so that you could refer back to it. Language actually requires numerous parts of the brain because it is a higher level cognitive function. So it doesn't just happen in those two temporal lobes. It actually, when you are participating in language, the brain is firing all over the brain. Higher level cognitive functions use more areas of the brain. So connectivity amongst networks is critical. Interaction with language cannot happen without it. So you must be connecting all these different parts of the brain. Even though particular parts of the brain are recognized for their specific language function, all parts end up being involved. So even though the two temporal lobes are the ones that we talk about around language development and language comprehension, basically the whole brain, because it is a higher level cognitive function, the whole brain ends up being involved in some way. Okay, so let's have a look, a further look at the left and right hemisphere. So remember, I circled these. So we have the two hemispheres. Okay, I'm just going to erase that so we can see. So I think we've all probably heard, I'm a left brain kind of person. I'm logical, I'm analytical, I'm mathematical, I'm not very creative. Or you might say, I'm a right brain kind of person. I'm passionate and I'm creative and I'm musical and I'm artistic. Actually, it's kind of more become of a cultural thing to say that versus an actual neuroscience based concept. So basically, the idea of a separate right and left hemisphere, we have right and left hemispheres in our brain, but that the right side is actually more dominant, and if the right side is more dominant, then you are more creative and all those things. It actually doesn't have a lot of scientific background. Basically, those concepts, right and left hemisphere, started, look how long ago, 1844, 1861, and 1865. These concepts started, and I'm going to just read you a few things about this because I think it's sort of interesting that it's still so dominant, like 180 years later. It's kind of crazy. So basically, Arthur Wiggin in 1844, he published a book entitled A New View of Insanity, Duality of the Mind. And this is where he described the brain as having independent parts, having an independent way and will of thinking. Robert Louis Stevenson, you probably heard, an author, wrote a book in 1886 describing a man who acted on both parts of his brain. So this is the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So when he was Dr. Jekyll, he acted totally different than when he was Mr. Hyde, and he was actually accessing this left. He was actually clicking totally from right to left to right to left. Okay, so these ideas are very much not really grounded in 20th or 21st century ideas about that we now know from MRI imaging about how the brain works, but yet it's still sort of dominant. We still sort of hear this concept. So it's really stayed with us into the 21st century. So when you hear people say, yeah, I'm really artsy and I'm not very logical, I'm really right brain, you can challenge them and say, yeah, no, actually, you don't have any scientific background for saying that. Okay, let's now, so kind of like, oops, I just moved that over there. Kind of like the Phineas Cage situation where there was some brain damage. Broca and Wernicke, who did a fair bit of brain study, again in the 1800s, we call these areas after them because they were the first ones to sort of discover these areas. And they found that when the particular area that is the left frontal hemisphere for Broca's area, when there was damage to the left frontal hemisphere, when there was damage to that part of the brain, it involved, and I'm going to just read this so I get it exactly right. It involved left frontal hemisphere involves the expressive aspects of spoken and written language. Okay, so this is like the production of sentences constrained by the rules of grammar and syntax, so they can actually express themselves. So this is one of the main areas of the cerebral cortex responsible for actually producing language. So if you damage the Broca area, you lose your ability to actually communicate or express language. So what I want you to do is, again, I want you to stop the video and I want you to watch. This is a really interesting video about Sarah. She had a stroke when she was 18 and it affected her Broca's area. And you can see how her speech was affected. So watch the first video here. And then watch, several years later, she's videoed again, and watch how her brain, because she was so young, she was 18, she was so young, her brain was actually able to heal itself. If you damage your brain when you're younger, your body is more plastic and it's more able to repair itself. If you have brain damage when you are older, your body just doesn't do what it used to, and it doesn't have that capability to repair itself. So watch those two. Stop right now. Watch those two because it's super interesting. Okay. Let's now look at Wernicke's area, which is the left posterior hemisphere. And basically, this is our ability to comprehend written and spoken language. So we're actually comprehending it. Its functions seem to contribute to language understanding by allowing us to interpret the meaning of individual words and then using them in their proper context. Okay, so I'm just going to read you a little bit of history about Wernicke as a scientist. German neurologist Karl Wernicke is credited with discovering the function of this brain in 1873. He did so while observing individuals with damage to the posterior temporal lobe of the brain. He noticed that one of his stroke patients, while able to speak and hear, was not able to comprehend what was being said to him, nor could he understand written words. After the man died, Wernicke studied his brain and discovered a lesion in the rear temporal region of the left hemisphere of the patient's brain, located close to the auditory region. He concluded that this section had to be responsible for language comprehension. So, if you have Wernicke's aphasia is basically some kind of damage. That's basically what aphasia means, and some kind of damage. If they have Wernicke's aphasia, they have difficulty comprehending language. They're able to speak words that sound grammatically correct, but they actually make no sense. And they may just include unrelated words or words that have no meaning in the sentences. So I want you to, this little guy is super cute on here, but on this video. So I want you now to go to this video and watch it and listen to, he sounds like everything is fine, but listen to what he's actually saying. It makes actually absolutely no sense. So he has damage to his Wernicke's area of his brain. Okay, so stop the video, go watch that one. Okay, back, here we go. So the brain is this just amazing part of our body. And through, again, our MRI imaging that we now have, we can actually see what's going on in the brain when we are doing particular things. So, for example, a brain in idle thought, the left hemisphere is working, but the right hemisphere is hardly working at all. So this is idle thought. So you can only see, that's all that's really firing in the brain. Whereas when a brain is reading out loud, look at everything that is firing in the brain. It's creating those synapses, the neurons are flying. It's amazing stuff in here. And from our MRI imaging, healthy brain, when we're actually doing something, everything's firing. A vegetative state, when we are totally just not doing anything, is you can see how much different the actual firing, how different it is between a really healthy brain that is cruising along and a really vegetative state in there. Okay, so basically, there are a few things around brain development, language development that are just sort of interesting for you to know about as future teachers. So, what are sensitive periods in our brain development? So basically, a sensitive period is a time of growth in the brain. So when the brain is just growing, growing, growing. So this, I don't think this will be any big surprise to you, but in utero, humans are particularly vulnerable between 56 and 105 days because they are undergoing rapid growth. So their brain in utero is just cruising at that like month and a half to about 4 month stage. This is why if a mother drinks during this time, that the child will end up with really severe fetal alcohol syndrome, versus if the mother drinks later in the term, the child will still have fetal alcohol syndrome, but it won't be as severe. So that's why kids with FAS are on such a spectrum, because it really depends on when and how much the mother drank in utero. First year of life is a sensitive period, right? Think about 0 to 1, how much they are growing and how much they change. A little newborn, all the way up to a 1-year-old who can walk and starting to say their first words, those kind of things. Teenage years, rapid growth. So again, if you damage your brain in some of these or have an accident in some of these periods, it's a little trickier. It's a little trickier to recover because the brain is so rapidly changing. So if damage of the brain happens in this time, it's not as permanent because the brain has neuroplasticity, because it's growing so much, specifically in these times, and it can actually reorganize itself. In other times, brain damage is bad at any time, but particularly in these times, it can actually repair itself. Later in life, if you're like 40, 50, 70, you just don't have, the body doesn't have the capability to recover like it did in these particular periods. And so, that's why if there is some kind of accident later on in life, it's really, it's hard. It's hard to recover from brain damage in there. Okay, let's look at, do we have a relatively short window to learn a language in our lives, or is that false? These are kind of these things that are out there that we go, I wonder if that's true. So do we have a relatively short window to learn a language? Basically, in studies of children who are deaf and were not exposed to a language as babies, it was discovered that those who heard a language from birth developed native-like language fluency, whereas those who did not hear a language until later life exhibited significant deficits. Okay, so that might be one of those studies that says, yeah, we actually, we have a relatively short window to learn a language. However, the verdict is out if there's a golden time to learn a language, because it's ethically tricky to study language development, because you cannot ever really research ethically. You cannot deprive one child of exposure to language development for a scientific experiment. So when these things happen, sort of that are not actually an experiment, scientists are all over it. So what I want you to do, actually, I'll introduce this first. So if you took EdPsych last year, or you are with me with EdPsych this year, we looked at this, the 3 perfect strangers, where the 3 boys were separated at birth. Knowingly, the psychologist actually separated them, knowing that this was not a great thing, but he was super curious to discover about nature and nurture and language development and, neurological development, all those kind of things. But there's a real unethical part of that you are totally affecting these 3 young men's lives for a scientific experiment. Over here, this is the Dave and Louise Turpin, who in 2017 in California, it was discovered that they had held all of these kids in the house, basically hostage, for their entire lives, and that they were very abusive parents. And the 17-year-old actually escaped. And I'm just going to read this. The doctors who examined the children ranging from 2 to 29 years old found some who couldn't speak and a 12-year-old girl who didn't know the full alphabet. The 17-year-old said, I haven't finished first grade and I'm 17. So the speech language people, the neurologists, because this happened, now they can study the effect of very little language. But you cannot set up a study where you deprive children of language development and exposure to language in order to study it as a scientist. Super interesting, right? Okay, so what I want you to do right now is I want you to go to this website. It's a short article. It's about a Bucharest adoption agency, and they run a study. And I want you to think about the ethical implications of this study on the two groups of children. And we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about that in our Collaborate session. So be ready to talk about how you felt the ethical implications of this study, what those ethical implications were and are for when kids were separated into Group A and Group B. Okay, so that's for our Collaborate time. And finally, I alluded to this when at the beginning of the lecture, and the whole idea of language being restricted to the human species. It's been research in non-human primates reveal other species develop a reasonable size vocabulary. So other animals, especially primates, could actually have a vocabulary, but grammatical learning eludes them. So if we are talking about language as where we actually have comprehension, where we actually have grammar, not just communication, because you can say, yeah, the birds are communicating, the dolphins are communicating, the bears are communicating, and that's not the basis of this. For this particular case, is I want you to think about primates who can communicate using some vocabulary, but then they cannot manipulate the language and change the language like we in the human species do. So again, watch this Coco and Robin Williams. Unfortunately, Robin Williams is no longer with us, but it's an interesting look at, is language just a human species phenomena, or can it be across species? And we're going to have a little bit of a debate about that in our Collaborate time as well. So be ready, just jot down a few notes from the video, what you think, and we'll have a bit of a go with that during our Collaborate time. All right. Wow, that was a fast romp through the biological basis for language development. But again, I think it's important that you have a little bit of a sense of what is going on in the brain, what's going on in the body, and how do we actually understand this amazing thing that we do that we do in language, that we are actually able to communicate, and that we can actually do this in real time. Awesome. Hope you enjoyed that, and we will see you in Collaborate.